Martha Henderson had seen death in all its forms during her 3 decades of service to Carthage. She had watched children succumb to diphtheria, their small throats closing as they gasped for air. She had held the hands of men dying from gangrene after farming accidents, their bodies consumed by infection, despite her best efforts with carbolic acid and clean bandages. She had witnessed women bleed to death during childbirth, their lives slipping away no matter how desperately she worked to save them. Death was an intimate companion in her profession, and she had learned to read its approaching footsteps like others read the changing seasons. But the deaths that followed Sister Margaret's arrival felt different. They felt wrong in a way that Martha couldn't quite articulate at first, a wrongness that lodged itself in her chest like a cold stone and refused to be dislodged. The first death that truly troubled her was that of Samuel Brennan, a 42-year-old blacksmith who had fallen ill with what appeared to be pneumonia in late September. Martha had visited Samuel 3 days before his death, and while his fever was high and his breathing labored, she had seen men in worse condition pull through. Samuel was strong, built like an ox from years of working the forge, and his wife Lucy had been diligent about keeping him comfortable and hydrated. Martha had left the Brennan farmhouse with cautious optimism, telling Lucy that Samuel would likely turn the corner within a few days if his fever broke. That same evening, Lucy had sent for Sister Margaret, having heard from the other townswomen about the nurse's miraculous abilities. Sister Margaret had arrived at dusk, her grey dress blending with the gathering shadows, and had taken up position beside Samuel's bed with her medical bag and her rosary. She stayed through the night, Lucy later reported, never leaving Samuel's side, administering something she called fever powder and whispering prayers in Latin that Lucy didn't understand. By morning, Samuel Brennan was dead. Lucy had been grateful for Sister Margaret's presence, finding comfort in the fact that her husband had not died alone during the dark hours before dawn. She told everyone in town how gentle Sister Margaret had been, how she had helped Samuel pass peacefully, holding his hand and speaking soft words of comfort as he drew his final breath. But when Martha examined Samuel's body the following day, a task she performed for most deaths in Carthage to determine if any contagious disease might threaten the community, she found something that disturbed her deeply. Samuel's lips and fingernails had a faint bluish tinge that Martha recognized, but his pupils were severely constricted, pinpoint small, even in death. This was unusual for a man who had died from pneumonia. Martha had seen hundreds of pneumonia deaths, and while the blue lips were common from lack of oxygen, the constricted pupils suggested something else entirely. They suggested the presence of morphine or laudanum in quantities far beyond what would be medically appropriate. Martha said nothing to Lucy Brennan. She recorded her observations in her hidden journal and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was the death of old Benjamin Cole, a 78-year-old farmer who had been declining slowly from heart failure for months. Benjamin's death was expected. Martha had told his son Robert that his father likely had weeks rather than months remaining. But when Sister Margaret visited Benjamin on a Tuesday afternoon, he was dead by Wednesday morning. Again, the family expressed gratitude for Sister Margaret's compassionate care. Again, Martha examined the body and found the same telltale signs, the severely constricted pupils that shouldn't have been present in a man dying from heart failure. The third death was perhaps the most troubling. Emma Whitfield was only 19 years old, suffering from what Martha had diagnosed as a relatively mild case of typhoid fever. Martha had treated dozens of typhoid cases over the years, and while the disease was serious, young and otherwise healthy patients like Emma usually survived with proper care. Emma's mother, Sarah, had been caring for her daughter diligently, following all of Martha's instructions about keeping Emma hydrated and comfortable. Then, Sister Margaret had offered to sit with Emma one evening to give Sarah a much-needed rest. Sarah, exhausted from days of constant vigilance, had gratefully accepted. She retired to the next room and fell into a deep sleep. When she woke 6 hours later and returned to Emma's room, her daughter was dead, and Sister Margaret was packing up her medical bag, her face serene and sympathetic, as she explained that Emma had taken a sudden turn for the worse and passed peacefully in her sleep. But Emma's death made no medical sense to Martha. The girl had been improving steadily, her fever dropping, her appetite returning. There was no reason for such a sudden decline. When Martha examined Emma's body, she found not only the constricted pupils, but also a small puncture mark on the girl's inner arm, partially hidden in the crook of her elbow. It was the kind of mark left by a hypodermic needle, a relatively new medical instrument that was becoming more common in hospitals but was rarely seen in small towns like Carthage. Martha sat alone in her kitchen that night, her journal open before her, staring at the 3 names she had recorded: Samuel Brennan, Benjamin Cole, Emma Whitfield. 3 deaths in 3 weeks, all attended by Sister Margaret, all showing signs of morphine poisoning. She knew what morphine poisoning looked like. She had seen it once before, years ago, when a man in terrible pain from a lumber accident had accidentally taken too much laudanum and never woken up. But these weren't accidents. The doses would have been carefully calculated, deliberately administered. And that meant something far more sinister was happening in Carthage. Martha understood the gravity of what she was considering. To accuse someone of murder, especially someone the community had embraced as an angel of mercy, would require irrefutable proof. False accusations could destroy lives, could tear the town apart, could result in innocent people being hanged by vigilante mobs that were all too common in Missouri's rural territories. She had seen it happen in neighboring towns, had witnessed the ugly face of mob justice when emotions ran high and evidence ran thin. But Martha also understood that if she was right, if Sister Margaret was indeed killing her patients, then every day of silence was a day that put more lives at risk. How many more people would die while Martha gathered her evidence? How many more families would grieve unnecessarily while she hesitated to speak up? The question that tormented Martha most of all was why. Why would someone who presented herself as a healer deliberately kill the people in her care? What possible motivation could drive such horrific actions? Was it simply madness, the twisted pleasure of a disturbed mind that found satisfaction in controlling the moment of death? Or was there something else, something Martha hadn't yet uncovered? As October deepened and the nights grew colder, Martha made a decision. She would continue to observe, to document, to gather evidence, but she would also begin to warn people, subtly at first, to be cautious about allowing Sister Margaret to treat their loved ones alone. She would find a way to protect the community while she built her case, piece by careful piece, until the truth could no longer be denied. What Martha couldn't know was that Sister Margaret had already noticed her scrutiny. The silent angel of Providence Church was many things, but she was not unobservant. And women like Sister Margaret, women who had successfully hidden their true nature for years, were exceptionally skilled at eliminating threats before those threats could destroy them. Reverend Thomas Whitmore considered himself a good judge of character. In his 40 years of ministry, he had counseled hundreds of souls, heard countless confessions, and learned to recognize the subtle signs of deception and sin. He prided himself on his ability to see the good in people, even those whom society had cast aside. This quality had made him beloved by his congregation, but had also, on more than one occasion, made him vulnerable to those who exploited kindness for their own purposes. Sister Margaret had impressed him from their very first meeting. She had arrived at Providence Church on that September evening with a humility that seemed genuine, her eyes downcast as she explained her mission to serve the sick and dying. She spoke softly about her calling, about the years she had spent in St. Louis caring for patients in the overcrowded charity wards, about her desire to bring comfort to those in rural communities who had no access to proper medical care. The Reverend had been moved by her dedication, by the sacrifices she claimed to have made in pursuit of this noble calling. In the weeks since her arrival, Reverend Whitmore had watched Sister Margaret work tirelessly among his parishioners. She asked for nothing beyond the simple room behind the church and whatever food the congregation could spare. She attended every Sunday service without fail, sitting in the back pew with her hands folded in prayer, her lips moving silently as she recited the liturgy. She volunteered to clean the church, to tend the small garden behind the rectory, to help prepare meals for church gatherings. She seemed in every way to be exactly what she claimed, a devoted servant of God, committed to easing the suffering of others. But lately, the Reverend had begun to notice things that troubled him, small inconsistencies that nagged at the edges of his consciousness, like splinters too small to see but painful nonetheless. There was the matter of her past, for instance. Whenever someone asked Sister Margaret about her background, about where she had trained or which convent she had belonged to, her answers were vague and changed slightly with each telling. Sometimes she mentioned a hospital in St. Louis. Other times she spoke of training in Chicago. Once she had referred to working in a Catholic mission in New Orleans. But when Mrs. Patterson, who had family in New Orleans, tried to ask her about specific churches and streets in that city, Sister Margaret had quickly changed the subject. Then there was the issue of her medical knowledge. Reverend Whitmore was not a doctor, but he had been present at enough sickbeds over the years to recognize competent medical care when he saw it. Sister Margaret certainly seemed knowledgeable about medicines and treatments, but there was something odd about the way she worked. She insisted on privacy when treating patients, often asking family members to leave the room during her ministrations. She kept her medical bag locked at all times and became visibly uncomfortable when anyone asked about its contents. Most troubling of all were the deaths. Reverend Whitmore had presided over many funerals during his time in Carthage, but never had he seen such a concentrated period of loss. In the 6 weeks since Sister Margaret's arrival, he had buried 11 members of his congregation, 11 souls who had passed into the next world under Sister Margaret's watchful care. While it was true that several of these individuals had been elderly or seriously ill, others had seemed to be on the path to recovery before suddenly taking fatal turns for the worse. The Reverend had tried to dismiss his concerns as the paranoid imaginings of an old man who had seen too much death and suffering. But then Martha Henderson had come to see him. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October when Martha knocked on the door of the rectory. The Reverend welcomed her inside, offering tea that she politely declined. She sat across from him at his small wooden table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her usually composed face drawn with worry and exhaustion. Martha had not come to make accusations, she explained carefully. She had come to share observations and to ask the Reverend to consider certain facts. She pulled out her journal and showed him the names, the dates, the symptoms she had documented. She explained the significance of the constricted pupils, the suspicious timing of the deaths, the puncture marks she had found. She spoke in the measured clinical tone of someone who had spent years dealing with medical realities, but the Reverend could hear the fear beneath her words. When Martha finished speaking, Reverend Whitmore sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the names in her journal. He wanted to argue with her conclusions, to defend the woman he had welcomed into his church and his community, but he could not deny the evidence Martha had presented, could not ignore the pattern that was now undeniable once someone had pointed it out. The question was what to do about it. Martha had been right to come to him first, rather than going directly to Sheriff Morrison or worse, to the townspeople themselves. Accusations of murder, even when backed by medical evidence, could create chaos in a small community. There would need to be a careful investigation, proper procedures followed, irrefutable proof gathered before any public action was taken. But even as Reverend Whitmore agreed with Martha about the need for caution, even as they discussed how to proceed, a cold dread settled in his chest. If Martha's suspicions were correct, then he had invited a killer into his church. He had vouched for her character, had encouraged his parishioners to trust her with their most vulnerable loved ones. How many of those 11 deaths were on his conscience? How many people had died because of his naive willingness to see only the good in others? The Reverend made a decision in that moment. He would speak with Sister Margaret, would ask her directly about her background and credentials. He would observe her more carefully, would be present when she treated patients. And if he found any evidence to support Martha's suspicions, he would not hesitate to bring the full weight of the law down upon her, regardless of the scandal it would bring to his church. What Reverend Whitmore did not know, as he said goodbye to Martha and watched her disappear into the gathering dusk, was that Sister Margaret had been standing just outside the rectory window during their entire conversation. She had heard every word, had seen the journal with its damning documentation, had watched the Reverend's face as he struggled with the implications of Martha's evidence. Sister Margaret walked slowly back to her small room behind the church, her expression unchanged, her movements as graceful and serene as always. But inside, her mind was racing, calculating, planning. She had been in this situation before, in other towns, with other suspicious midwives and concerned clergy. She knew exactly what needed to be done. The following morning, Sister Margaret attended church as she always did, sitting in her usual pew at the back, her grey dress immaculate, her posture perfect. No one looking at her would have suspected that her mind was occupied with intricate calculations of risk and mitigation. She had survived this long by being methodical, by thinking several steps ahead of those who might threaten her, by understanding human nature well enough to manipulate it to her advantage. During the service, she watched Reverend Whitmore carefully. She could see the strain in his face, the way his eyes kept drifting toward her even as he tried to focus on his sermon. He knew something was wrong, or at least he suspected it. Martha Henderson had done her work well. The midwife was competent and observant, a dangerous combination in someone who had the Reverend's ear. But Sister Margaret had dealt with dangerous obstacles before. She had faced down suspicion in other towns, and she had learned that the most effective defense was not flight, but a carefully orchestrated counterattack. She would not run from Carthage. She would stay, and she would discredit her accusers before they could discredit her. Her first move came that very afternoon. She called on Mrs. Patterson, the wealthy widow whose daughter Martha had mentioned during her consultation with the Reverend. Mrs. Patterson was a woman of considerable influence in Carthage, the kind of woman whose opinion shaped the opinions of others. She was also, as Sister Margaret had noted, rather lonely since the death of her husband and the marriage of her children to people from distant towns. Sister Margaret sat in Mrs. Patterson's parlour, accepting a cup of tea and speaking in her characteristically quiet way about her concerns regarding Martha Henderson's judgment. She did not make direct accusations. Instead, she raised questions, doubts planted like seeds in fertile soil. "I have noticed," Sister Margaret said gently, "that Miss Henderson seems to have taken a particular interest in my work. I do not wish to speak ill of her, as she has devoted her life to serving the community, but I wonder if perhaps the stress of her responsibilities has affected her reasoning. The elderly do sometimes develop peculiar ideas about events they cannot fully comprehend." Mrs. Patterson had nodded, accepting the insinuation that Martha's age and stress might have compromised her judgment. Sister Margaret continued carefully, mentioning the possibility that Martha might be experiencing the early signs of mental decline, that she had been making odd comments about patients and their treatments, that her documentation seemed obsessive and paranoid. By the time Sister Margaret left Mrs. Patterson's home, the seed had been planted. Mrs. Patterson, who despite her wealth was chronically unhappy and eager for drama to break the monotony of provincial life, was already composing the gossip in her mind. She would mention to her bridge club that Martha Henderson had seemed rather distressed lately. That one wondered if the poor woman was pushing herself too hard. That age did catch up with everyone eventually. Sister Margaret's second move was even more calculated. She made a point of being seen visiting homes where residents were healthy and strong, people who had no need of medical care. She would sit with them, offer prayers, and then leave no less than an hour later looking serene and satisfied. When asked what she was doing, she would simply smile and say she was checking on parishioners who might not be as vigorous as they appeared, offering spiritual comfort to those who bore invisible burdens. This created a paradox that slowly began to undermine Martha's credibility. If Sister Margaret was truly killing her patients, why were these apparently healthy people still alive? Why would she minister to those who were not dying? People began to question Martha's interpretation of events. Perhaps the deaths were simply coincidental, a reflection of the natural mortality rate in a small town where medical care was primitive. Perhaps Martha, desperate to find meaning in the chaos of death, had constructed a pattern where none existed. By the end of the week, the mood in Carthage had shifted subtly but perceptibly. Martha Henderson, once respected as the community's reliable midwife, was now viewed with a certain wariness. People began to whisper that she was obsessed, that she was seeing conspiracies where there were none, that her mind was beginning to deteriorate under the weight of her years of service. The seeds Sister Margaret had planted were already beginning to take root. Reverend Whitmore noticed the shift in sentiment and felt his resolve wavering. What if Martha was mistaken? What if he had allowed her suspicious nature to cloud his own judgment? The Reverend was a man accustomed to trusting his instincts about people, and his instincts told him that Sister Margaret was genuine, was good. was exactly what she appeared to be. Sister Margaret, aware of the Reverend's internal struggle, decided it was time for the final move in her calculated game. She would give him a reason to believe in her completely, a reason that would make him her staunchest defender rather than her potential prosecutor. She would manufacture a miracle. The patient Sister Margaret chose for her manufactured miracle was Thomas Garrett, the blacksmith's 13-year-old son. Thomas had been ill for nearly a week with what Martha Henderson had diagnosed as scarlet fever, a disease that killed roughly 1 in 5 of its victims, particularly in children. The boy's fever had been climbing steadily, and his mother, Ellen Garrett, had been beside herself with fear and desperation. Sister Margaret had visited the Garrett home several times to assess Thomas's condition, each time offering prayers and comfort, but stopping short of any specific medical intervention. She had watched Ellen's desperation grow with each passing day, had seen the mother's eyes grow more haunted as her son's fever refused to break, and the characteristic scarlet rash spread across his small body. Then, on the 7th day of Thomas's illness, Sister Margaret made her move. She arrived at the Garrett home in the late afternoon, her medical bag in hand, her face grave but determined. She asked Ellen to leave the room, explaining that she needed to examine the boy more thoroughly, and that his mother's anxiety was communicating itself to her son, making him more agitated and raising his fever further. Ellen, desperate and exhausted, agreed immediately, grateful for any form of hope that Sister Margaret's presence seemed to offer. Sister Margaret remained alone with Thomas for nearly 2 hours. What Thomas didn't know, what Ellen didn't know, what no one in Carthage could have known, was that Sister Margaret possessed knowledge about scarlet fever that went far beyond what was taught in the frontier towns of Missouri. She understood that scarlet fever was caused by a bacterial infection, that the fever and rash were the body's immune response to that infection. She understood that many children's bodies fought off the infection naturally over time, that recovery was possible even without medical intervention, that the disease often ran its course after approximately 7 to 10 days. Thomas Garrett was, in fact, beginning to turn a corner. His fever had peaked 2 days earlier and had been slowly declining since then. His body was beginning to fight off the infection naturally. With another few days of proper care and hydration, the boy would almost certainly recover on his own. But Sister Margaret had no intention of allowing nature to take its unspectacular credit. Instead, she administered what she claimed was a new and powerful medicine from St. Louis, a treatment so potent that it could turn even the most severe cases of scarlet fever. The medicine was actually nothing more than water mixed with a small amount of quinine, which produced no actual medicinal benefit, but tasted bitter and authoritative, the kind of thing that desperate mothers would believe could save their children's lives. She then sat by Thomas's bed and performed a ritual of prayer and laying on of hands, speaking in low, urgent tones as though communing with divine forces. She adjusted his blankets, changed the cloth on his forehead, whispered assurances that the fever would break by morning. When she emerged from his room 2 hours later, her face was flushed with what appeared to be the exertion of spiritual and medical labor, her expression suggesting that she had engaged in a profound struggle between life and death. "His fever has begun to break," she told Ellen Garrett, taking the woman's trembling hands in her own. "The medicine is working. By tomorrow morning you will see a marked improvement. The crisis has passed." Ellen Garrett wept with relief, falling to her knees and thanking God for sending this miraculous woman to save her son's life. She pressed money into Sister Margaret's hands, money the nurse refused at first, before accepting with humble grace, suggesting the funds be donated to the church instead. Sure enough, by the following morning, Thomas Garrett's fever had broken completely. The rash was already beginning to fade. Within 2 days, the boy was sitting up and asking for food. Within a week, he was walking about the house, his health fully restored, his mother convinced that he owed his life to Sister Margaret's intervention. The story spread through Carthage like wildfire. Sister Margaret had saved young Thomas Garrett, had brought him back from the brink of death through her medical expertise and her spiritual dedication. Even the few townspeople who had harbored doubts about the nurse's intentions found themselves wavering. How could someone who performed such miracles possibly be a threat to the community? Reverend Whitmore heard the story and felt something shift within him. He visited Thomas Garrett himself and was moved to tears by the boy's recovery. When Ellen Garrett described how Sister Margaret had fought for her son's life, how she had seemingly pulled him back from death itself, the Reverend's earlier doubts seemed foolish and baseless by comparison. By the time Reverend Whitmore spoke with Martha Henderson again, his demeanor had changed entirely. He was apologetic, suggesting that perhaps they had both been too quick to judge, that Sister Margaret's dedication to her patients had clearly been validated by young Thomas Garrett's miraculous recovery. When Martha tried to explain that Thomas's recovery was likely natural, that scarlet fever often resolved on its own, the Reverend listened politely but without conviction. The manufactured miracle had worked perfectly. Sister Margaret had transformed herself from a suspect into a savior, and she had done it with nothing more than timing, observation, and the manipulation of natural human processes. Martha Henderson found herself increasingly isolated, her warnings dismissed as the obsessive concerns of an aging woman who couldn't accept that miracles were possible. Sister Margaret's victory was nearly complete. All that remained was to ensure that Martha Henderson would never be in a position to threaten her again. Martha Henderson's isolation in the community deepened with each passing day in late October. What had once been respect for her medical knowledge and dedication had transformed into whispers of concern about her mental state. Even patients who had long trusted her began to hesitate before calling on her services, preferring to send for Sister Margaret instead, the woman who had saved young Thomas Garrett's life. Martha understood what was happening. She could see the manipulation clearly, could recognize the calculated steps Sister Margaret had taken to undermine her credibility. But understanding the game did nothing to help her win it. She was an elderly woman without allies, without evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, without the social influence necessary to challenge the narrative that was being constructed around her. She continued to keep her journal, recording her observations and suspicions, but she did so now in secret, aware that if Sister Margaret discovered her documentation, it would only add fuel to the fire of accusations that Martha was obsessed and paranoid. She attended church less frequently, avoided social gatherings where she might encounter the townspeople who now viewed her with suspicion, spent her evenings alone in her small cottage at the edge of town. It was during one of these solitary evenings in early November that Martha first felt the subtle signs of illness. It began with a slight headache, the kind that came and went, nothing particularly alarming for a woman of Martha's age. She assumed it was stress, the accumulation of worry and frustration that had been weighing on her for weeks. She made herself a cup of tea with honey and tried to sleep, expecting to feel better in the morning. But by morning the headache had intensified, and she had developed a fever. Her joints ached, her throat felt raw, and she found herself chilling despite the extra blankets she had piled on her bed. Martha recognized the early symptoms of influenza, a common enough illness that usually resolved on its own within a week or two, though it could occasionally turn serious in the elderly or those with other health conditions. She decided to rest at home, sending word through the townspeople that she would be unavailable for medical services for a few days. She expected the usual soup and bread that neighbors typically brought to the sick, though she wasn't surprised when no one came. Sister Margaret had done her work well. What Martha did not know was that her illness was not the result of natural infection or chance encounter with a virus. On her last visit to the general store, when Martha had set down her medical bag while selecting supplies, Sister Margaret had been waiting. Using a small key that had been remarkably easy to acquire, she had opened Martha's bag, located the instruments inside, and deliberately contaminated them with material taken from a patient suffering from a particularly severe case of influenza. When Martha had used those instruments the following day to treat a patient, she had exposed herself to a concentrated dose of the virus, far more than she would have encountered through normal means. It was a careful, calculated method of infection, one that would appear completely natural, that would arouse no suspicion, that would be attributed simply to bad luck and the inevitable hazards of Martha's profession. Over the following week, Martha's condition deteriorated more rapidly than a typical influenza case. Her fever climbed higher, reaching dangerous levels that left her delirious with heat. Her cough became severe, productive, leaving her gasping for breath between spasms. She developed aches so profound that moving from her bed became an agony. On the 8th day of her illness, when Martha's condition had become critical, when her breathing had become labored, and her mind was slipping in and out of consciousness, there came a knock on her door. It was Sister Margaret, her grey dress pristine, her expression filled with tender concern. She had come, she explained to the few neighbours who were watching, to offer her medical expertise to someone who had dedicated her life to serving others. It was only right that the community's healer should receive care in her time of greatest need. Martha, in her fevered state, was not entirely certain who the woman at her bedside was. She knew only that someone was there, speaking in soothing tones, administering medicines in small doses. Sister Margaret's presence seemed to drift in and out of reality, sometimes appearing as an angel of mercy, sometimes as something far more sinister that Martha's fevered mind could not quite define. Sister Margaret spent the afternoon and evening at Martha's bedside, maintaining a vigil that seemed, to any outside observer, to be the height of compassionate care. She changed Martha's bedding, administered cool cloths to bring down the fever, whispered prayers and words of comfort. She also, during the long hours of the night when Martha was semi-conscious and delirious, administered doses of morphine that went far beyond what would be medically appropriate. By dawn, Martha Henderson's breathing had become shallow and irregular. By mid-morning, she had stopped breathing altogether. Sister Margaret sat beside the dead woman's body for several minutes, her face serene and peaceful. Then she stood, straightened the blankets, arranged Martha's body in a position of rest and left the cottage. She would return later that day with Reverend Whitmore, expressing her grief that despite all her efforts, despite her dedication and skill, she had been unable to save the life of the community's beloved midwife. The death would be recorded as influenza complicated by age and exhaustion. Martha Henderson would be mourned as a woman who had given everything to her community and whose own health had suffered as a result of her dedication. There would be sympathy for her struggle, sadness at her passing, and absolutely no suspicion that she had been deliberately murdered. Sister Margaret's greatest threat had been eliminated, and she had done it in a way that would only increase her reputation as a caring and devoted healer. Martha Henderson's funeral was attended by nearly the entire town of Carthage. She was buried on a grey November afternoon, with Reverend Whitmore presiding over the service and speaking eloquently about her decades of service, her dedication to the community, and the toll that such demanding work could take on even the strongest among them. Sister Margaret stood in the front row of mourners, her face a perfect mask of grief, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched a handkerchief to her chest. Reverend Whitmore's sermon, though intended as a tribute to Martha, inadvertently served as the final nail in the coffin of suspicion that had surrounded Sister Margaret. The Reverend spoke of how Martha's exhaustion and stress had possibly clouded her judgment in her final years, how sometimes the weight of responsibility could distort one's perception of reality. He spoke of Sister Margaret's compassionate care, how she had stayed with Martha through the night, how she had administered medicines and offered prayers, how she had done everything in her power to save a woman whose health had simply been too compromised by years of hard work. If Martha had harbored any doubts about Sister Margaret's nature, the Reverend suggested, those doubts had been the product of an overburdened mind, rather than genuine evidence of wrongdoing. Martha was, and would always be remembered as, a dedicated healer and a pillar of the community. But perhaps, the Reverend concluded gently, her final years had been marked by a certain paranoia that was not entirely her fault, a sad but inevitable consequence of age and stress. Sister Margaret's victory was now complete and absolute. With Martha gone, there was no one in Carthage who had the knowledge, the courage, or the credibility to challenge her. The doctor from the county seat, when he was finally called to examine Martha's body, found nothing suspicious in her death. She had died of influenza complicated by advanced age and exhaustion. There was no reason to suspect foul play. But Sister Margaret, despite her victory, was aware that the situation in Carthage had begun to change in subtle but important ways. The town's initial enthusiasm for her presence had peaked. The people of Carthage, though they no longer actively suspected her, had become accustomed to her presence in a way that made her less special, less remarkable. The gratitude and reverence that had once surrounded her was fading into comfortable familiarity. This was the pattern Sister Margaret had observed in other towns, other communities. The initial excitement of having a dedicated nurse available would eventually give way to routine. She would become simply part of the fabric of the town, expected to be available, taken for granted, no longer a marvel but merely a practical necessity. And when she eventually left, as she always did, there would be little fanfare, little investigation into why she was departing or where she was going. But Sister Margaret was not yet ready to leave Carthage. There was something about this town, something about the church and the community and the isolation of the prairie, that appealed to her in a way that other places had not. She had been in Carthage for less than 3 months, and already she had eliminated the 2 people most likely to pose a threat to her. The townspeople had accepted her, trusted her, given her access to the most vulnerable members of their community. Why should she leave now when she had such complete control over her situation? Why not stay through the winter, perhaps into the spring? There was no law enforcement agency in Carthage capable of investigating complex crimes. The nearest sheriff was in a town 30 miles away, a man overwhelmed with his own jurisdiction's problems. As long as deaths appeared natural, as long as there was no one to question them, Sister Margaret could continue her work indefinitely. The winter of 1888 was particularly harsh. Snow fell heavily throughout November and December, and temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. The frontier isolation that had seemed merely inconvenient in autumn became a genuine hazard. Elderly residents developed pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses. Children fell sick with colds that turned into more serious infections. The weakened and vulnerable members of the community became especially susceptible to illness and death. Sister Margaret moved through the winter like a silent spectre, appearing at sickbeds, offering care and comfort, administering her medicines. Her reputation as a healer only grew stronger as the winter progressed. When she was present at a patient's bedside, people believed that everything possible was being done. When patients under her care died, their deaths were attributed to the severity of winter illnesses, to the limitations of frontier medicine, to the will of God. What Sister Margaret did not fully anticipate was that her extended presence in Carthage would attract attention from outside the town. A circuit judge passed through on his way to another county seat in early December, and striking up a conversation with Reverend Whitmore in the general store, mentioned that he had heard about a remarkable nurse named Sister Margaret who was working in Carthage. The judge, curious about this woman, made inquiries among his contacts in neighboring towns. What he discovered troubled him deeply. In the 3 towns where Sister Margaret had worked previously, there had been unusual concentrations of deaths among patients under her care. In one town, a doctor had become suspicious enough to write letters to his colleagues in other regions, describing his concerns. In another town, a man claiming to be the brother of a deceased patient had attempted to file a complaint, though it had been dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a grief-stricken man. By early December, the judge had made a decision. He would personally investigate Sister Margaret when he returned to the region in January. He would interview patients and families, examine medical records, and determine whether there was sufficient evidence to warrant official investigation into the deaths that had occurred under her care. Sister Margaret did not yet know that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. The first indication that Sister Margaret's carefully constructed world was unraveling came in mid-January, when Circuit Judge Samuel Hartwell arrived in Carthage, accompanied by a state investigator from Jefferson City. They came quietly, without fanfare, and they did not announce their purpose immediately. Instead, they spent 3 days conducting interviews, speaking with families of the deceased, examining Reverend Whitmore's records of the funerals he had conducted since Sister Margaret's arrival. Sister Margaret became aware of their presence on the 2nd day of their investigation. She observed them speaking with Mrs. Patterson, watched as they left the general store with written records of purchases, noticed when they visited the homes of families who had lost loved ones to illness. She understood immediately what was happening. The investigation she had feared, the scrutiny she had learned to evade in other towns, had finally arrived. Her first impulse was flight. She could pack her belongings that very night, disappear into the winter landscape, and lose herself in another town, another state, another identity. She had done it before, had successfully reinvented herself multiple times over the years, but something held her back. Perhaps it was arrogance, the belief that she had been too careful, that the evidence against her was too circumstantial to warrant real concern. Perhaps it was a recognition that running would itself constitute an admission of guilt. Instead, Sister Margaret decided to fight. She had one advantage that the investigators did not yet fully appreciate: the unwavering support of Reverend Whitmore and the deep trust of the community she had cultivated so carefully. When Judge Hartwell and the state investigator, a thin, serious man named Coleman, requested a formal interview with Sister Margaret on the third day of their visit, she received them in the church parlor with complete composure. She answered their questions thoughtfully and thoroughly, explaining her background, her medical training, her dedication to her work. She acknowledged that she had come to Carthage without extensive documentation of her credentials, explaining that she had been eager to help and had not anticipated that such paperwork would be necessary in a small community. When confronted with the death records and the unusual concentration of deaths under her care, Sister Margaret did not deny the facts, but instead recontextualized them. Yes, many of her patients had died, she acknowledged sadly, but that was precisely because she was called to care for the most critical cases, the patients whom the community's other medical resources had already deemed beyond help. She was in essence a healer of last resort, and it should not be surprising that her patient population had a higher mortality rate than the general population. Judge Hartwell and investigator Coleman were experienced men, accustomed to deception and skilled at reading the subtle signs of guilt. Sister Margaret's explanations, while logical on the surface, seemed rehearsed to them, almost as though she had prepared for exactly this line of questioning. But prepared answers were not the same as evidence of guilt. Without specific, verifiable proof of wrongdoing, without medical evidence that poison or excess medication had caused the deaths, their hands were tied. The investigator requested permission to exhume the bodies of several patients who had died under Sister Margaret's care. Judge Hartwell, recognizing the significance of such an action, prepared to issue the necessary legal documents. But it was Reverend Whitmore who inadvertently saved Sister Margaret from this final threat. The Reverend, deeply troubled by the suggestion that Sister Margaret might have deliberately harmed her patients, but equally unable to deny the pattern of deaths that the investigators had documented, found himself in a position of agonizing conflict. He believed in Sister Margaret's goodness, had witnessed what he interpreted as miracles of healing, had felt the genuine compassion in her ministrations. Yet the numbers were undeniable, the pattern was clear, and the evidence was mounting. In his distress, Reverend Whitmore made a decision that would define his place in this tragedy forever. He approached Judge Hartwell privately and convinced him not to pursue the exhumations, arguing that such actions would create scandal and distress for the grieving families without necessarily producing conclusive evidence. More importantly, the Reverend offered to conduct a more discreet investigation within the church community, assuring the judge that if Sister Margaret had indeed committed crimes, he would ensure that the evidence was turned over to the authorities. Judge Hartwell, weary from his investigation and faced with the Reverend's passionate defense of Sister Margaret, agreed to the compromise. He would return to Jefferson City, document his suspicions and concerns in an official report, and await further developments. If Sister Margaret remained in Carthage, he assured the Reverend, they would be watching her very carefully. But Sister Margaret understood that her time in Carthage had effectively ended. The investigation, while not conclusive enough to result in arrest, had created a shadow of suspicion around her that would only grow darker with time. The community's trust, while still outwardly intact, had been compromised. More investigators would come, more questions would be asked, more bodies would eventually be exhumed. On a cold night in late January, Sister Margaret left Carthage. She departed quietly, leaving behind a brief letter of resignation addressed to Reverend Whitmore, explaining that she had decided to pursue other opportunities for service in a larger city where her skills could be more fully utilized. She took very little with her, just her medical bag and the clothes on her back, disappearing into the winter darkness like the ghost she had always resembled. The town of Carthage gradually returned to normalcy. Reverend Whitmore, conflicted and uncertain about whether he had made the right choice, continued his ministry. The families who had lost loved ones to Sister Margaret's care eventually found peace in their grief, attributing their losses to the harsh realities of frontier life rather than to deliberate malice. But in a small ledger hidden in a church drawer, there remained a record of her time in Carthage, the names of the dead, the dates of their deaths, and the terrible knowledge that an angel of death had walked among them, feeding on the vulnerability and trust of those who had no one else to turn to. Sister Margaret herself disappeared into history, leaving behind only questions and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes evil can walk in the light while wearing the mask of mercy, and that sometimes, even when we recognize the darkness, we lack the will or the evidence to stop it. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.